Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Podcast channel. We are genuinely thrilled to have you here with us today.
It is, yeah, it's really great to be here.
And if you find yourself getting value out of these deep dives, where we take these massive, complex topics and really pull them apart layer by layer, we'd love to invite you to subscribe so you never miss a moment of what we're exploring.
Definitely. And today we are doing something that it feels heavy, but it also feels really necessary. We're stepping into a story that I think most people for the last 3 years believed was completely finished.
Absolutely. Over. Done with.
A story that felt like it had a period locked and sealed at the end of the sentence.
And that story is the case of Lucy Letby. And for most people listening, just saying that name conjures up a very specific, very dark image. In 2023, she was convicted of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 7 others at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
It was a verdict that didn't just shake the UK. It shook the world. The judge at the time called her actions cruel, calculated, and cynical.
I remember those words specifically. They were on every front page.
They were. She was branded Britain's most prolific child serial killer in modern history. And the sentence reflected that total certainty. She is currently serving 15 whole life orders.
And just to be clear for everyone, a whole life order means just that.
It means, under the current terms, she is never intended to walk free again. The door is locked, and they've thrown away the key. That was the public understanding.
Right. And at the time, looking back at the media coverage, the headlines were absolute. There was no ambiguity. It was monster nurse, angel of death.
Pure evil. That was the narrative.
But, and this is the entire reason we are sitting here today.
Right.
We're recording this in early February 2026.
Yeah.
And the ground has shifted beneath this case in a way that is honestly staggering.
It certainly has. We are witnessing what legal observers and, serious journalists are calling a total narrative inversion.
That is such a strong phrase, inversion. It implies everything is flipping upside down.
It is, because if you look at the landscape right now, the certainty that surrounded that 2023 verdict is, well, it's eroding at a pace I've rarely seen in criminal justice history. It's like watching a cliff face just crumble into the sea.
And what's causing this erosion? What are the big events?
Well, there are a few bombshells. First, you have the release of the Netflix documentary, The Investigation of Lucy Letby, which just dropped this week and is causing huge waves.
I've seen the trailer for that, yeah.
Then you have an unprecedented dissent coming from the Royal Statistical Society.
The actual Royal Statistical Society, the official body.
The official body. They are weighing in on the math used in the trial, and they are not happy. And then, maybe the biggest piece of all, there is a massive application that has been submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC.
And that is our mission for this deep dive. We aren't here to act as judges. We are absolutely not here to retry the case based on vibes or emotion.
No, not at all.
But we have a stack of source material. We have expert reports. We have legal filings from 2026, transcripts that paint a picture that is profoundly different from what was on the front pages 3 years ago.
And we're going to look past the sensationalism. We are going to examine the specific medical, the statistical, and crucially, the systemic evidence that has led a panel of international experts to call this potentially the grave miscarriage of justice of our generation.
That's a quote that gives you chills.
It really does. So a quick disclaimer before we jump into the weeds here.
Please.
We are impartial observers. We are reporting on the source material provided. Our goal is to explore why the narrative has shifted so dramatically and what that means for our understanding of justice, science, and how we treat, really complex data in the courtroom.
Okay, so let's start where the jury started. To understand the criticism, we first need to understand the foundation of the conviction itself. We need to look at what we're calling the bedrock. What was the case that the prosecution built?
Right. The prosecution's case was effectively a 3-legged stool, and it was compelling because it felt so comprehensive, so solid.
What was the first leg?
First, you had the common denominator theory. They presented a chart, a really powerful visual aid, that showed a spike in baby deaths and collapses at the hospital. And the one constant, the one person present for every single one of those suspicious events was Lucy Letby.
I remember seeing that chart on the news. It was absolutely everywhere. It looked like a grid, right? Dates on one side, nurses' names across the top.
Exactly. And there were just these X's, these black marks in the column under her name over and over again. Visually, it was devastatingly effective.
It looks like a pattern. The human brain is designed to see patterns, and that screamed pattern.
It simplifies a very complex reality into something that seems undeniable. So that's leg one. Leg two was the methods, the how.
The actual mechanics of the alleged murders.
Yes. They had specific methods of harm they alleged she used. They claimed she injected air into babies' veins, causing what's called an air embolism. They claimed she injected air into their stomachs via nasogastric tubes. The idea there was it would cause the diaphragm to splint, basically suffocating them.
Horrific.
They also claimed she poisoned 2 babies with insulin. And in some cases, they alleged physical trauma, specifically a liver injury on one of the babies. So it wasn't just one thing, it was a portfolio of methods.
Which makes it sound more calculated, doesn't it? Like she was experimenting.
That was certainly the implication. And then, of course, you have the third leg of the stool, which for many people was the emotional closer.
The confession. The Post-it notes.
Yes, the handwritten notes found in a search of her home, and on them she wrote phrases like, "I am evil, I did this."
And for the public, for the jury, that has to be the final nail in the coffin. I mean,
Right.
Why would an innocent person write, "I did this"?
Exactly. You can almost hear the thoughts in the jury room. The science is complicated, the stats are a bit much, but she wrote it down in her own hand. For many people, that was it. Case closed.
So that's the bedrock. A nurse who is always present at every death. Medical experts who are saying these deaths were unnatural and pointing to specific methods, and a handwritten note that reads like a confession. It seems airtight. So why are we even talking about this 3 years later?
Because of what happened, or rather what didn't happen, during the defense phase of the trial.
Okay.
In the original trial, the defense team made a strategic decision that is now being, just excoriated by legal experts in the new team.
And what was that decision?
They called 0 expert witnesses to refute the prosecution's medical claims.
Wait, I want to make sure I heard that right. You're saying 0. So when the prosecution's expert, Dr. Evans, stood up and said, "This baby died of an air embolism."
There was no doctor on the other side, on the defense side, standing up to say, actually, the science suggests otherwise, or that's a misinterpretation of the symptoms, or here's another plausible explanation.
The jury only heard one side of the medical science.
They only heard one narrative. They heard the prosecution's theory, and then they heard silence. And in a courtroom, you have to understand, silence is often interpreted as agreement, or at the very least, a lack of a viable defense.
It's a vacuum, and the prosecution's story fills it completely.
Completely. The jury had no alternative scientific narrative to even consider. And now, in 2026, now that independent experts are finally looking at the raw medical data, that bedrock is being described by the new legal team as shifting sands.
Shifting sands. That's a powerful image. It suggests the whole foundation is unstable.
That's the argument, that what seemed like solid rock was actually built on a foundation of misinterpretation and unchallenged claims.
Okay, let's unpack this. If the defense didn't bring experts then, the new legal team certainly is now. So let's start with the medical evidence. One of the main ways Letby was accused of killing these babies was air embolism. Can you just, for us non-medical people, explain what that actually is?
Sure. An air embolism is, it's essentially an air bubble, a pocket of gas that gets into the blood vessels.
Okay.
If that bubble is large enough, it can travel through the circulatory system and get stuck, blocking the flow of blood, kind of like a cork in a bottle. And if it blocks a critical artery to the heart or the brain, it leads to cardiovascular collapse or death.
And the prosecution's lead expert, you mentioned him, Dr. Dewey Evans. He was a retired pediatrician. He's the one who identified these cases of air embolism as the cause of death.
He was the key medical voice for the prosecution.
And how did he identify them? Was it through a clear finding in an autopsy, like, I don't know, an examiner finding a massive bubble of air in the heart?
Well, this is the really contentious part. In many of these cases, no. There was no big bubble found at autopsy. He based his diagnosis largely on a specific clinical symptom that was observed by other staff members before the babies died.
Which was?
Skin discoloration. Witnesses described unusual patches of color appearing on the baby's skin, a sort of mottling or blanching. And Dr. Evans argued that this specific type of discoloration was a hallmark sign of a deliberately injected air embolism.
A smoking gun symptom.
That's how it was presented. And to support this scientific claim, to give it weight, the prosecution cited a seminal research paper from 1989.
Okay, citing a 1989 paper. That sounds like standard medical practice. You rely on the published literature. You find a study that backs up your claim.
It does. It sounds perfectly normal until you talk to the man who actually wrote the paper.
Oh, The author's still around.
He is, and this is a huge development. Enter Dr. Shu Li. He is a world-renowned Canadian neonatologist, a giant in his field. He co-authored that specific 1989 paper on air embolism in neonates. And in late 2025 and now in early 2026, he has come forward and he is featured prominently in the new Netflix documentary, saying that his research was, and these are his words, misused and misinterpreted by the prosecution.
Misused how? Did they just get the page number wrong or something?
It's much more fundamental than that. It's a physiological error, a misunderstanding of basic biology. Dr. Lee's paper described arterial air embolism.
Arterial.
Yes, that happens when air gets into the arteries, the vessels carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart. In premature babies, this usually happens as a complication from high-pressure ventilation support. The machines that are breathing for them can sometimes accidentally push air into the blood.
I see. So it's a known, though rare, complication of medical care.
Exactly. But the prosecution was accusing Lucy Letby of injecting air into the veins. That's a venous air embolism.
And those are different. I mean, it's all just blood vessels, right?
Physiologically, they are very, very different systems. Arteries take oxygenated blood away from the heart under high pressure. Veins bring deoxygenated blood back to the heart under low pressure. Dr. Lee explains that the circulatory dynamics are totally distinct. The way an air bubble behaves in an artery is not how it behaves in a vein.
Okay, so they cited a paper on apples to prove something about oranges.
That's a good way to put it. But it gets even more specific. He says the key symptom, the skin discoloration, does not match. In his 1989 paper, the very specific sign of arterial air embolism was described as bright pink vessels against a blue background.
Bright pink vessels against a blue background. That sounds very, very specific. It's something you'd recognize if you saw it.
It is. It's a very particular pattern. He describes it as looking almost like lightning bolts of pink on a blue field. It's called levato reticularis. But the witnesses in the Letby trial didn't describe that at all.
What did they describe?
They described blanching, migrating patches, and general mottling. Dr. Lee argues that these two things are not the same. He says that the general discoloration seen on the babies in Chester does not match the very specific diagnostic sign from his paper.
So the symptom is wrong.
The symptom is wrong. And furthermore, he has stated that venous air embolism, the type Letby was accused of causing, does not cause that kind of skin discoloration at all. There is no established medical literature that says injecting air into a vein creates that visual effect on the skin.
So just to be crystal clear on this, the expert who literally wrote the book on the symptom that the prosecution used is now on record saying that, one, the symptoms seen in hospital don't match his research, and two, the crime she was convicted of, venous air embolism, doesn't cause those symptoms anyway.
Precisely. Dr. Lee's conclusion, after reviewing all the case files with his own team of experts for the CCRC application, was that there was, and I'm quoting him, no medical evidence of malfeasance in any of the cases.
No evidence.
None. He believes the deaths were likely due to natural causes, specifically poor perfusion. Basically, when a very sick baby is dying of sepsis or circulatory shock, their circulation starts to shut down. The body pulls blood to the core organs, and when that happens, you get weird, blotchy, discolored skin. It's a natural, though tragic, process of dying, not a sign of murder.
Wow. That is a massive blow to the bedrock. If the entire air embolism theory is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of a key scientific paper, the whole thing starts to wobble pretty badly.
It does. It calls the very first pillar of the medical case into question.
But air embolism wasn't the only mess it alleged, right? What about the air in the stomach theory? That was another big one.
Right. This was the accusation that she killed babies. Specifically, they named baby C, baby I, and baby P by injecting a large volume of air into their stomachs through their nasogastric feeding tubes.
And the theory was what? That the stomach would inflate like a balloon?
Exactly. The prosecution argued that this massive amount of air would push up on the diaphragm, which is the big muscle under your lungs, that would compress the lungs and stop the baby from being able to breathe.
And what do the new experts, people like Dr. Lee's team, say about that mechanism?
They argue it is physiologically implausible.
Implausible? Why? It sounds plausible on the surface.
Well, think about basic anatomy. The stomach isn't a sealed, rigid balloon. It's a muscular bag. It has an inlet, the esophagus from the mouth, and an outlet, the pylorus, which leads to the intestines.
Right.
The argument from neonatologists now is that babies, even very premature ones, have natural mechanisms to deal with excess gas in the stomach. They burp, they vomit, the gas can pass through into the intestine and come out the other end.
That makes intuitive sense. I mean, we burp babies all the time for that very reason.
Exactly. The experts are saying it is incredibly difficult to kill a baby simply by putting air in the stomach because the pressure would find a way out long before it became lethal to the lungs. The baby would likely vomit spectacularly first. And there were no reports of that kind of massive vomiting.
So it's just not a viable murder method in their view.
Not a plausible one. And what's really interesting is that it seems Dr. Dewey Evans, the original prosecution expert, may have realized the weakness of this theory as well.
Oh.
There are reports surfacing now in the new legal filings that post-trial he has shifted his view on at least one of these cases. For baby C specifically, it's reported that he is now leaning toward air embolism instead of air in the stomach as the cause of death.
Wait, hold on. Let me get this straight. The prosecution's own expert is changing his mind about the cause of death after the conviction has been secured and she's in prison for life.
That is what the defense is arguing, and you can see why that is so legally problematic. If the mechanism of death changes from air in stomach to air in vein years later, it suggests there was never any certainty about how that baby died in the first place.
Of course. How can you convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt if the how of the crime keeps shifting? It implies the initial diagnosis was just a best guess, not a certainty.
And that raises a huge question about consistency. If the science was solid, it shouldn't be moving around like this. It feels that they're trying to find a theory that fits rather than letting the evidence lead to the theory.
Which is the opposite of how science should work.
Mhm.
But okay, let's move to what the prosecution themselves called the smoking gun, the thing that felt the most concrete, the insulin.
Yes. This is often the point cited by people who still believe she is guilty. It's the evidence that seems impossible to explain away. You know, they'll say, okay, maybe the air stuff is debatable, maybe it's complex, but what about the poison?
Right. Let's lay out the claim. 2 babies, identified as baby F and baby L, had very high levels of insulin found in their blood tests. And since Letby was on duty, and babies, especially premature ones, don't just naturally produce massive amounts of insulin like that, or so the argument went.
The only conclusion, the prosecution argued, was that she must have deliberately injected them with synthetic insulin from a vial. It was presented as cold, hard, chemical proof of poisoning.
On the surface, I can see why that's so powerful. High insulin sounds like definitive proof.
Yeah.
But you've hinted we need to look deeper. We need to look at how that insulin was measured.
Exactly. The science is in the details. They used a laboratory test called an immunoassay.
Immunoassay. What is that in simple terms?
It's a standard screening tool used in hospitals all over the world. It's designed to give doctors a quick yes/no or a rough estimate of what is going on in a patient's blood. It's fast and it's cheap.
But I feel a but coming.
But the lab that performs these tests, and this is crucial, the lab itself explicitly states, this is a warning that comes with the test results, that this test is not robust enough for court use. It is not a forensic grade test.
Why not? Why isn't it robust enough for legal purposes?
Because of a well-known problem in biochemistry called cross-reactivity. The test is designed to look for the insulin molecule, but it can get confused. It can't always distinguish between synthetic insulin, the drug that comes in a bottle, and the body's own naturally occurring insulin-like substances.
So other things in the blood can look like insulin to the machine.
Yes. Specifically, in very sick or premature babies, their bodies can produce something called insulin-binding antibodies.
Insulin-binding antibodies. So the body's making something that, to the testing machine, looks exactly like a huge dose of insulin.
Exactly. These antibodies can essentially trick the test. They can bind to the natural insulin in the body and make it unreadable, or they can directly interfere with the assay itself, leading to a result that looks like a massive, off-the-charts insulin spike, when in reality, there isn't one. It's a ghost reading.
So to know for sure, to prove it was synthetic insulin and not these antibodies or some other interference, you'd need a better test, right?
You would. You need a confirmatory test. The gold standard is something called liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. It's a much more sophisticated test that can actually separate the molecules and identify synthetic insulin definitively.
That sounds complicated and expensive. Was that test ever done?
It was never done.
Never. So they convicted her of poisoning based entirely on a screening test that the lab itself warns is not proof for legal proceedings.
Correct. The prosecution argued that the overall clinical picture of the babies, they had low blood sugar fit with insulin poisoning, so they didn't need the forensic test. But science is about precision, not just about fitting a picture. And there's another layer to this that makes it even more complex. It's the C-peptide issue.
I've heard this mentioned in the reports. What exactly is C-peptide?
It's pretty standard biology for endocrinologists, but it's key here. When your pancreas makes natural insulin, it produces a byproduct called C-peptide. And they are produced in a perfect 1-to-1 ratio. For every one molecule of insulin your body makes, it also makes one molecule of C-peptide.
Okay, perfect pair?
A perfect pair. Now, if you inject synthetic insulin from a bottle, that drug doesn't contain C-peptide. So what you'd expect to see is very high insulin readings, but very low C-peptide readings, because the body senses all the extra insulin and stops making its own.
And these babies had low C-peptide levels.
They did, and the prosecution stood up and said, see? High insulin, low C-peptide. That is the classic signature of synthetic insulin poisoning. Case closed.
That logic seems really sound on the face of it.
It does. It's very compelling. Until you bring the antibodies back into the picture. Experts like Professor Jeff Chase, who's a world-renowned biomedical engineer, and Helen Shannon, a biochemist, have submitted new reports arguing that this data was completely misinterpreted.
Yeah.
They argue that if the insulin reading was artificially inflated by antibodies, if it was a ghost reading to begin with, then the ratio of that reading to the C-peptide level is totally meaningless. You are comparing a false inflated number to a real number. Of course the ratio is going to be weird. They argue the data is actually entirely consistent with natural variations in very sick infants, or simply a testing error caused by cross-reactivity.
The whole foundation of the C-peptide argument rests on the insulin number being accurate in the first place.
And if it's not, the whole thing collapses. And there's a logistical problem too, isn't there? A really practical, real-world problem, the missing insulin.
Right. Where did the poison come from?
It's a huge logistical problem. To achieve the insulin readings found in those tests, and we're talking readings that were off the charts high, without killing the babies immediately, you would need incredible precision. You'd have to manage the dose perfectly to keep them alive, but hypoglycemic.
Which would require access to the insulin stock.
A lot of it. And insulin is a controlled substance in a hospital. The stock is kept in a locked fridge. It's tracked. Every vial is accounted for.
So was any insulin reported missing from the Countess of Chester Hospital?
No, not a single vial. The hospital conducted audits. They checked the stock. No insulin was ever reported missing. No empty vials were found in the bins. To poison these babies in the way alleged, Letby would have needed multiple vials, keys to the fridge, the ability to draw it up and inject it into nutrition bags without anyone seeing her. And yet the stock count was perfect.
That is just bizarre. If you are pouring a large amount of insulin into a baby's feeding bag, the bottle has to come from somewhere. It doesn't just appear out of thin air.
Exactly. And here is the real kicker. The detail that often gets left out of the summaries, but is absolutely crucial to understanding the doubt around this. There was a third baby.
A third baby? I thought only 2 F&L were the alleged insulin poisonings.
Those were the 2 she was charged with. But another baby in the unit during the same time frame had very similar blood test results, the same pattern of high insulin and low C-peptide.
Okay, but Letby wasn't charged with poisoning that baby. Why not?
Because that baby survived and was transferred to a specialist children's hospital, and there they did a proper workup and diagnosed the baby with a natural congenital condition. It's called congenital hyperinsulinism.
Whoa, wait. So there is a known natural medical condition that can create the exact same blood test results that were used to convict her of double murder.
That is the argument the new experts are making. If one baby on the unit is proven to have a natural condition that perfectly mimics the signature of poisoning, why couldn't the other 2 have had the same undiagnosed condition?
If you have 3 babies with weird insulin levels, and one is proven to be from natural causes, it seems like a huge leap to assume the other 2 must be murder. It could just as easily be the unit had a cluster of babies with this rare condition.
That's precisely the point. It casts an enormous shadow over the smoking gun. It sounds less like a smoking gun and more like a malfunctioning flare gun. It's signaling that something is medically wrong, but maybe not what we think it is.
It certainly complicates the narrative of certainty. But we have to talk about the other pillar of the case. The one that, for many people, came before the science, the statistics, the chart.
The famous shift roster chart, the one with all the X's. I bet if you ask people what they remember from the trial, it's that chart.
I can see it in my head right now. It's an indelible image.
Right. This chart showed Letby present at every suspicious death or collapse. And for a jury, that is so powerful. It's just common sense, right? She's always there. What are the odds? It has to be her.
It feels intuitive.
It does. But statisticians have a name for this kind of thinking. They call it the Texas sharpshooter fallacy.
I love that name. It's so evocative. But what does it actually mean in practice? How does it apply here?
So imagine a cowboy who has never held a gun before. He goes up to the side of a barn and just fires his entire revolver randomly at the woods. He's not aiming at anything.
Okay.
After he's finished shooting, he walks up to the barn, looks at all the scattered bullet holes, finds the tightest little cluster of 3 or 4 holes, and then he takes out a can of paint and paints a bullseye target right around them.
Ah.
Then he stands back, calls his friends over, and says, "Look, I'm a sharpshooter."
He makes the data fit the conclusion he wants. He draws the target after the event around the results that prove his point.
Exactly. And the Royal Statistical Society, and again, this is a major scientific body, this isn't some fringe group, has come out and publicly criticized the way this data was presented to the jury. They argued that the chart suffered from massive, massive selection bias.
How so? What was selected or deselected?
The chart only included events that the prosecution had pre-selected, events where Letby was present or that the consultants, looking back, deemed suspicious. It completely excluded any deaths or collapses that happened on the unit when she wasn't there.
Wait, so there were other deaths or collapses when she wasn't on duty?
Yes, there were. And if you remove those from the data set, you are artificially creating a correlation. You are hiding all the misses and only showing the hits. It's like the sharpshooter hiding all the bullet holes that didn't land in his painted target.
So if you look at the full picture, at all the adverse events,
the correlation with Lucy Letby dissolves, or at least it becomes much, much weaker. You find that, yes, she was a nurse who worked a lot of shifts. She often did overtime. She worked in a high-intensity unit where sick babies sadly die. The probability of her being present for deaths was naturally going to be higher just because she was physically there for more hours than many other nurses.
it reminds me so much of the Lucia de Burke case in the Netherlands.
It is a chilling, chilling parallel. Lucy de Burke was a Dutch nurse who was convicted back in 2003 of murdering 7 patients, and the case against her was almost entirely statistical.
I remember reading about this. The numbers were astronomical.
There were. One expert testified that the chance of her being present at all those deaths by pure accident was 1 in 342 million.
That sounds definitive. 1 in 342 million. Those are impossible odds. You'd have to believe she was the unluckiest person in human history.
It sounded definitive, and it was enough to convict her. She spent years in prison. She was branded a monster, the angel of death, but it was all wrong. The math was fundamentally flawed. It was another Texas sharpshooter case. Eventually, the deaths were proven to be natural. She was fully exonerated in 2010. It's now considered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in modern Dutch history.
And the Royal Statistical Society is essentially saying, we're watching the same movie again.
They are. They are raising a massive red flag and warning that we are being dazzled by bad math, by a correlation that looks powerful but is meaningless because of how the data was selected.
And there was a statistician involved in the Letby case early on, wasn't there? A Professor Jane Hutton.
Yes. This is a detail that has come out more recently and is very troubling. The police actually hired Professor Jane Hutton, a respected medical statistician, to analyze the data early in the investigation.
And what did she say?
She said that to do a proper, meaningful analysis, she needed to see all the data, the whole unit's data, every nurse, every shift, every death, every collapse, patient acuity levels, staffing levels for each shift.
That makes sense. You need the full context. You need the denominator to make sense of the numerator.
But allegedly, her work was halted. The prosecution, or the police, decided not to proceed with her full analysis. Instead, they stuck with the simple, visual, and as we now hear, statistically flawed chart of Letby was there.
That is deeply concerning. If you stop the expert because they want to look too deep, it implies you might be afraid of what they'll find.
It suggests a powerful confirmation bias. They had their suspect, and they were looking for data that supported that theory, not data that might challenge or disprove it.
So this is where we are. If the statistics are a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, and the medical evidence for both air embolism and insulin poisoning is being systematically dismantled by top experts in their fields, what is actually left? If she didn't kill them, the question becomes, why did all those babies die?
That is the billion-dollar question. The prosecution would say the context, the chart, the confession proves her guilt regardless. But the defense and these new experts are now pointing to a very different context, the hospital itself.
Right, Section 5. the hospital environment, because these babies didn't just die in a vacuum. They died in a specific place at a specific time.
And that place, the Countess of Chester Neonatal Unit in 2015 and 2016, is now being described by multiple independent experts as a unit that was out of its depth.
What does that mean, practically, out of its depth?
It was a level 2 neonatal unit. In the UK system, that means it's designed for relatively stable babies who need some help, maybe some breathing support or feeding tubes, but not the highest level of intensive life support.
Okay.
But due to a lack of available beds elsewhere in the region, they were routinely accepting level 3 babies. These are the very premature, very sick infants with complex, life-threatening needs. So you have what's called an acuity mismatch. They were trying to care for babies that they weren't really equipped or staffed to handle.
And what about the staffing levels?
They were chronic. Reports that have come out since the trial show nursing levels were consistently 20% below the national standard. Nurses were looking after more babies than is considered safe. They were stretched thin, exhausted, and making mistakes.
But it gets worse than just numbers, doesn't it? It gets more visceral. Let's talk about the sewage.
Yes. This is a detail that sounds almost unbelievable, but it's documented. There was a recurring serious plumbing issue in the hospital, and sewage was repeatedly backing up into the sinks in the nursery rooms.
Sewage? In a neonatal intensive care unit?
Raw sewage. In the rooms where you have these incredibly vulnerable babies with literally zero developed immune systems.
That is horrific. It's a breeding ground for infection.
Exactly. And with sewage comes bacteria. That brings us to the bugs. The unit had a known, documented issue with Pseudomonas aeruginosa in the water taps.
Pseudomonas? What is that?
It's a bacterium. For a healthy person like you or me, if we came into contact with it, it might cause a minor skin infection or nothing at all. For a premature neonate with undeveloped lungs and no immune system, it is a lethal pathogen. It causes devastating pneumonia, sepsis, rapid collapse, and death.
Was this brought up at trial? The fact there was a lethal pathogen in the water supply?
The defense mentioned the plumbing issues in passing, but the full extent of the Pseudomonas risk was not fully emphasized as a primary alternative cause of death for these babies. It was background noise, not a central theme.
But the new expert panel, Dr. Shuli's team, they have looked at the files and they've identified specific alternative causes for these deaths, haven't they?
They have, and they are all linked to this environment of poor care.
Like what are the alternatives?
Sepsis, overwhelming infection, pneumonia, which matches the Pseudomonas presence perfectly. They also point to things like accidental liver trauma from vigorous CPR.
Wait, explain that one. Because the prosecution said Letby physically assaulted a baby E, causing a liver injury. That sounds brutal and deliberate.
It does, and it's a terrifying accusation. But CPR on a tiny 2-pound baby is a violent act. It has to be. You are compressing the chest hard and fast to try and restart the heart. Experts in resuscitation now say that the type of liver injury described is actually consistent with the kind of trauma you can accidentally cause during a chaotic emergency resuscitation. It doesn't prove murder. It could just as easily prove a desperate, frantic attempt by medical staff to save a life.
So a sign of a failed rescue, not a successful murder.
Potentially. And what about dislodged breathing tubes?
That was another accusation, right? That she
Yeah.
sabotaged them.
Yes, but these tubes dislodge all the time. Active babies move, they wriggle, tubes slip. It happens in the best units in the world.
Yeah.
But in a unit that is chronically understaffed, where nurses are stretched thin and can't watch every baby every second, a dislodged tube might not be noticed as quickly as it should be. And that can lead to a rapid collapse.
So the argument here is that this was a failing hospital, a unit taking on babies it couldn't handle with too few staff in a dangerously unhygienic environment. And when the death rate inevitably spiked, instead of looking at the systemic failures,
They looked for a scapegoat. That is the scapegoat theory in a nutshell, that the hospital management and the senior consultants, people like Dr. Brewery and Dr. Jairam, who first raised the alarm, failed to recognize their own unit's incompetence.
it's a huge blind spot.
It is. The theory goes that they couldn't accept that their standard of care was substandard. So when they noticed a statistical correlation with Lucy Letby being on shift, they latched onto it. It is psychologically so much easier to blame a single malevolent presence than it is to admit to the world that you let sewage back up into a nursery or that your staff missed a sepsis diagnosis.
That is a very heavy accusation. It suggests a massive institutional failure and potentially a cover-up to protect reputations.
It does. But it aligns with that moment in the Netflix documentary with Dr. John Gibbs.
I saw that clip. It went viral.
Yes. Dr. Gibbs, one of the senior consultants at the unit, admitted on camera to a tiny, tiny guilt, his words, wondering if they got the wrong person, if they had pushed this in the wrong direction.
That's the first crack in the armor, isn't it? The first admission of doubt from one of the original accusers.
To hear a consultant admit any level of doubt, even a tiny one, is incredibly significant. It opens the door to the possibility that they saw a pattern and interpreted it through the lens of malice, when it may have been a pattern of systemic failure.
But we have to come back to the psychology of it. We have to talk about the confession. Because even if the science is shaky, even if the stats are flawed, people look at that Post-it note, I am evil, I did this, and they just can't get past it. It feels like an admission of guilt.
It's the emotional hook of the entire case. It's the thing that makes it all feel real. But like everything else, we need to put those notes in their proper context. When were they written?
They were found in her home during a police search, right?
Yes, but they were written after she had been removed from the neonatal unit. She was under intense scrutiny. She'd been suspended. Her colleagues were shunning her. The police were investigating her. She was being accused of being a baby killer. And crucially, she was in therapy and had been advised by her therapist to write down her feelings as a way of processing the trauma.
So this wasn't a secret diary of a killer. This was a therapeutic exercise.
That's the argument from the new psychological experts. It was a brain dump, a stream of consciousness. And if you read the whole note, not just the cherry-picked line the prosecution put up on a giant screen in court, it's full of contradictions.
Like what?
She writes, I'm evil, but in the same note, she also writes, I haven't done anything wrong, and I feel very alone and scared. She writes, I did this, but she also writes, I don't deserve this.
I haven't done anything wrong. Does not sound like a confession. It sounds like the exact opposite.
No, it doesn't. And psychology experts and the new defense team now frame these notes not as a factual confession of criminal acts, but as an anguished outpouring. It's the writing of a deeply distressed, isolated woman who is internalizing the blame being heaped upon her.
So the interpretation is, I must be evil because all these babies died on my watch and everyone is telling me it's my fault.
Exactly. It's a distinct psychological phenomenon. You could call it imposter guilt or survivor guilt, amplified to a horrific degree. This tragedy happened around me, therefore I am responsible for it, therefore I am an evil person. It's a psychological state, not a factual admission.
That paints a profoundly different picture than a cold-blooded killer keeping a trophy of their crimes.
Yeah.
It sounds like someone having a complete mental breakdown.
Exactly. And treating a mental breakdown as a criminal confession is incredibly dangerous if you ignore the full context.
So this all brings us to today. Here we are in early 2026. The medical science is being fundamentally challenged. The statistics are being ridiculed by the highest authorities. The confession is being completely recontextualized. What is actually happening in the legal sphere right now? Is she going to get a retrial?
Well, there is huge momentum building. Mark McDonald, Letby's new lawyer, has submitted a massive, comprehensive application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the CCRC.
And that application contains what?
It contains everything we've discussed. It includes over 30 new expert reports detailing the flaws in the case, the air embolism theory, the insulin science, the statistical fallacies, the hospital environment. It's a mountain of new evidence.
And politically?
Yeah.
Is anyone paying attention?
Yes. David Davis, who is a very prominent and respected member of Parliament, is now leading debates in Parliament, publicly calling for a retrial. He's putting significant pressure on the justice system to look at this case again. He's framing it as an issue where the very integrity of the British justice system is at stake.
And then there's the ongoing public inquiry, the Thirlwall inquiry, right? How does that fit in?
It creates a massive, almost bizarre tension. The Thirlwall inquiry was set up by the government to investigate how the hospital failed to stop a murderer. Its entire premise is that she is guilty. It assumes guilt.
While at the same time,
the CCRC process is actively investigating whether she is, in fact, innocent. So you have these two massive state-sanctioned legal processes moving in completely opposite directions. One assumes she did it. The other is asking if she did it at all. It's an extraordinary situation.
And the Crown Prosecution Service, the CPS, they made a decision in January of this year regarding the other charges, didn't they? The ones the jury was hung on.
They did, and it was a big moment. They announced they would not be pursuing a retrial on the remaining charges, and their stated reason was a lack of evidence.
Which the defense campaign has interpreted as
a sign that the whole case is crumbling. Their argument is, if the modus operandi was so clear, if the pattern was so obvious, why can't you prove it in these other cases? The defense argues it's because the evidence was never really there to begin with.
This brings us to a really difficult and frankly unsettling place.
Yeah.
We effectively have two Lucys.
We absolutely do. On the one hand, you have the Lucy Letby who was convicted by a jury in 2023, the calculated, cruel, cynical serial killer who deceived everyone around her.
And on the other hand,
And on the other hand, you have the Lucy Letby described by this new wave of international experts, a dedicated but perhaps overwhelmed nurse who has become the victim of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, a scapegoat for a failing NHS trust.
it is a core tension. On one side, you have the finality of a whole life order, the justice system saying this is done, the book is closed. And on the other side, you have science and statistics screaming, wait, you got the math wrong, you got the medicine wrong.
And that is the terrifying heart of this story. The legal system, it struggles with highly complex science. It struggles with statistics. It relies on the testimony of experts. But if the experts in the first trial were wrong, or if their testimony went completely unchallenged, the system can fail. It just processes the input it is given. If the input is bad, the verdict is unsafe.
It forces us to ask a really provocative and uncomfortable final question. And I want you, the listener, to really sit with this for a moment. If the medical evidence, the air embolism, the insulin poisoning, is scientifically implausible, or, at best, unproven, and if the statistics are a logical fallacy, what is actually left of the case against her?
Is it possible for an innocent person to be found guilty of such heinous crimes, not because of overwhelming evidence, but purely because a system in crisis needed someone to blame for its own catastrophic failures?
That is the question that will define the next few years of this story, and it's one we will be watching very, very closely.
Absolutely. This story is very far from over.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Sleep Podcast channel today. We hope this deep dive gave you something to think about and helped clarify why this story, which everyone thought was finished, is suddenly back in the headlines.
It's an incredibly complex story, but understanding the details, the science, it really matters.
If you enjoyed this episode and our approach, please consider subscribing to the channel. We'll be back with another deep dive very soon. See you next week.
See you next week.